and I'm Becky Denon. I am one of your hosts today. I am the Executive Director of Social Venture Partners San Antonio. For those of you who don't know much about Social Venture Partners, we are a network of philanthropists and social investors engaged in 40 cities across the United States and in 8 countries around the world. We have 400 active donors in our network. We call them partners. And together we amplify our giving by engaging with nonprofits. We connect them to our networks and our resources, and we leverage what we know and who we know so that we can have greater impact in our communities. It's a wonderful association. So let's get started. I'm first going to introduce you of one of our panelists who is my friend and somebody who inspires me every day, and that's Sandra Morales. Sandra is the Executive Director at House of Neighborly Service here in San Antonio. It's a community-based organization, and she has been there since 2009. Now, what stands out about Sandra is that she grew up in this neighborhood and moved back, as she describes it, to a very special place where the neighbors are proud, we are close, and we help each other every day. Knowing this tight-knit community so well, Sandra brings a deep appreciation for what it takes to overcome and how to address inequity for the family and her staff of 20 serve. HNS has been helping families in 3 of the most poverty-stricken zip codes in Texas for more than 100 years. Their work was founded through the Presbyterian Church and reflects much more what is common in nonprofits in San Antonio than your, say, larger, better funded human services organizations. They partner with other nonprofits and they provide preschool, youth after-school programs, a food pantry, crisis help for families, and senior wellness programs. When someone walks in their door, no one's turned away. Their team touches every generation with whole life help and gives them opportunities to succeed. Sandra's active in the nonprofit community. She's an alumna of several fellowships, including the Social Venture Partners Fellowship. And she is one of the key nonprofit leaders that our local elected leaders call on for advice. I'm excited to have Sandra on the panel. Somebody else I want you to know is Jessie Cronin. Jessie's Executive Director for Social Venture Partners Boston. This organization's been around a little bit longer, and she's going to tell you about that. Jessie's professional career was focused on nonprofit leadership and management with international development. She served as Executive Director of Gardens for Health International, a Boston-based nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and nutrition in Rwanda for 5 years before joining Child Relief International Foundation. Jessie's going to tell you a little bit more about her work in Boston, and I turn this over to you, Jessie. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Becky. It's really wonderful to have so many people here for this conversation. I think for all of us, this is, diversity, equity, and inclusion is incredibly important. And it's something that, we're really centering our work around, which we probably should have been centering it around these concepts far earlier. But I think now it really is the time for us to have some of these harder conversations and dig a little bit deeper, which is a lot of what we're doing, in this discussion. Our SVP chapter is similar in a lot of ways to SVP San Antonio. We also have a network of about 100 partners, and we provide a combination of financial support and pro bono consulting to nonprofits in our network, and kind of acknowledging or understanding the important role that leaders of color play in the sector and how disproportionately, challenging it is for those leaders. We've actually launched a new funding track called our Equity Track, which supports early stage organizations led by people of color. And that is exactly a nice segue into introducing Dr. Charles Daniels. Charles is the Executive Director of Fathers Uplift, an incredible organization that works in Dorchester, and it works to basically empower fathers and their families. He's able to share his knowledge about the transitions to fatherhood and speak to and motivate fathers, in some of the most challenging places. His wealth of experience comes from many public organizations, including the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families and Boston Public Commission. Charles is also an Obama Fellow, So we're not the only ones to realize just how great Father's Uplift is. And it's an absolute privilege to have him as a part of our portfolio and as a part of this panel. I'll also take a moment to introduce our moderator. Michael Smith currently serves as the Director of Youth Opportunity Programs at the Obama Foundation, as well as the Executive Director for the My Brother's Keeper Alliance. Within these two positions, he aims to open opportunities for underrepresented youth, with the My Brother's Keeper Alliance focusing specifically on males of color. Michael has served on many community projects and public offices, including the Obama administration's Social Innovation Fund, and the Case Foundation, and the Family Center Boys and Girls Club. It's an absolute privilege to have Michael leading this discussion, and I don't want to take up any more time. Let's hand it right over.
Well, thank you so much. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. It is an honor to have the opportunity to be here with all of you, certainly with with our incredible panelists, but just with folks that are committed to creating change and not working at it at the surface level, but really going to change systems and making sure that we're scaling opportunities that will make a difference in the lives of young people and families all across this country. So I'll tell you a little bit about My Brother's Keeper and help to anchor this conversation, and then we'll go ahead and we'll get into the conversation. So My Brother's Keeper was launched by President Obama in 2014, and the impetus for My Brother's Keeper were two things. One was the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin, and then watching George Zimmerman get acquitted. And President Obama wanted to create a national moment where young men of color knew that they mattered, knew despite what they were seeing on the news, that their lives mattered, their talents mattered, their skills mattered, and that the United States needed young men of color to be successful, and that we loved them, cared about them, and we were going to do whatever we could within our power to build solid pathways to opportunity for them. The other reason that My Brother's Keeper was started in the summer of 2013, we were seeing some really troubling signs. While the entire domestic policy agenda for the Obama administration had been about creating these clear pathways to opportunity for everyone and opportunity for all, we were just seeing troubling, startling data over and over again for our Black, Latinx, and tribal young men of color on every key indicator of long-term success, whether it was reading at third grade level, interaction with the criminal justice system, employment. We were seeing opportunity gaps of 20% or more behind. And we knew that wasn't because our young people weren't talented, that they weren't gifted, that they didn't have contributions, but we knew that that's what systemic inequity combined with gender bias had created for boys and young men of color over 400 years in this country. And so the president wanted to say, what's going on here? Let's see if we can find out and do something differently, direct the federal government and call communities across the country to action around this work. And so in February of 2014, we turned 7 this year, President Obama launched the My Brother's Keeper initiative in the East Room of the White House. 22 federal agencies and White House offices being directed to presidential memorandum to do whatever we could to address these persistent opportunity gaps that boys and young men of color face, and to make sure that all young people can reach their full potential. Fast forward to 2021, which still feels like we're living in some future movie whenever I say 2021. Fast forward now, My Brother's Keeper lives as an initiative of the Obama Foundation, where we no longer are in the federal government, so we have doubled down on the work that's happening in our 250 My Brother's Keeper communities across the country. And we are doing whatever it is that we can to build safe and supportive communities where boys and young men of color feel valued and have clear pathways to opportunity. We do that through grant programs. We do that through community investment. We do that by building this incredible cross-sector network of folks that are making a difference. And we do that by mobilizing action in various ways. Sometimes it's mentoring calls to action. Sometimes, like this summer, it was calling mayors to action to review and reform use of force policies as it affected Black communities, especially young Black men. So that's My Brother's Keeper. And I think part of the reason I was asked to be a part of this conversation today is we are so committed. At the root of the work that we're doing is about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that we build a society where your race, your zip code, your gender does not become a limiting factor for where you can go. One of the things that we've thought about this year a lot is this summer, the American Psychological Association released a report that said, not only are we in a global pandemic, but we are in a racism pandemic. And that really got us to thinking, what does that mean? And essentially what they said is we are seeing really an unprecedented and extraordinary disproportionate impact of the pandemic on communities of color, but also the related economic downturn, where so many people that are in communities of color are doing the jobs where, a lot of times I hear people say, oh, we're all working from home now. Actually, we're not all working from home. There are a lot of people that are showing up every day and have no choice in order to feed their family. So we're seeing the economic downturn really having a big impact. We're seeing the impact of school closures having a big impact on communities of color. Then we saw the impact of police violence, which is certainly not new, but was shown in ways that we hadn't seen before. And we saw the incredible response. And then sadly, we also saw upticks of violence that are the cause of all of these, are the result of all of these other things. And so the APA gave us words to say we are in a racism pandemic. And if we don't do something to address the systemic racism that gets us to these problems, if we don't get to root causes, if we don't have real honest conversations, all of the programming that we want to do, all of the nice things that we want to do, all of the putting on jackets and serving soups and giving hugs doesn't make a difference if we don't get to these root causes. So we have an extraordinary panel of Dr. Daniels and Sandra Morales, who's going to talk to you about the work that they're doing. I think really get to the roots of what does this look like from the point of view of someone that is doing this work on the ground, what the relationship needs to be like with philanthropy and with the social venture world, to how we can get to a place where we make a difference. So I want to just go straight to them by asking them both a foundational question of what does DEI mean to you and your organization? Not as just sanitized words, but how does that show up in your mission and how you serve the communities that you serve? And while I turn those questions over to you, Becky, let me know if we're still going to do those polls. And if we do, we'll come to it after the first question. So Sandra, do you want to start with the question about DEI?
Hi, good morning. So when it comes to DEI and House of Neighborly Service, we serve a predominantly Hispanic, Latino community, and we've been serving them for over 100 years. So when you talk about that, although we serve that population, we also, we don't close our doors to anyone, as Becky mentioned, but we see a lot of the inequities, right, that go on with that population we serve. We're located about a mile and a half from downtown San Antonio. And so the area that we serve is considered, we say it's the heart of the West Side, but others can view it as the wrong side of town. Assumptions are made about people that live within that area. And so it makes it difficult when you have people who are, who meet challenges day to day, right? And so when they're faced with trying to find those resources to help them, it makes it difficult. When you have city funding that is not put towards that side of town, so you see what you normally wouldn't see on the other side, which is considered the northeast of San Antonio. So you see stray dogs, you see streets that have not been repaired but patched, right? You see, you don't see sidewalks. You see a lot of people walking on the streets. You see abandoned buildings that have not been taken care of, abandoned houses. And I live within the zip code, the prime zip code that we serve. So 2 houses down from me is an abandoned house that has been there for at least 10 to 15 years and has not been taken care of. And that's that we make calls to the city to come and check it, and nothing's been done. So those are the kinds of things that we see on this side of town. And so we have families who have been residing here for a number of years. And then we also have families who are very mobile and move from home to home because they're living from paycheck to paycheck. And so those families that we serve, their annual incomes vary from about $5,000 to $25,000 at the most a year. And this can be for a family of 4 to 6. So you just don't see a lot of the help out there. And our people are very proud. And I say our people because I am Latina. And so they're not looking for a handout, and we're not looking to give them a handout. We're looking to give them a hand up. And so in many cases, I think that's what a lot of government agencies don't see, is that it's not, I mean, you have people, right, in whatever ethnicity that may take advantage of the system, right? But then you have those who work hard, who are always trying to find a way just to make ends meet. And those are the people that I feel are being neglected and are also being stereotyped. And so so that's what comes to mind, you know, when I think about the organization and the people that we serve, and just a lot of the inequities that are out there. I can give you a list and keep going on and on, you know, digital divide, that kind, you know. So, I mean, that's just what we face.
Sandra, thank you for painting that picture. And it's a result of very real decisions that have been made over the course of many years, and decisions that we're actively making in our budget choices and our policy choices. It didn't just happen by accident. And so I really appreciate you painting such a vivid picture of how those choices show up every day in the lives of your community. Dr. Daniels, let's go to you. How does DEI show up in your work, your mission, and how you serve the community that you serve?
Thank you so much. You know, that's a great question. And one thing that I think about is making sure that our constituents can see themselves when they enter our office. You know, and what does that look like? You know, we have a shortage of clinicians of color in this country, right? Sound, qualified therapists that are able to provide that necessary guidance. One of the main requests of single mothers bringing their children to us, or fathers entering our agency, is that they want a clinician of color, someone that looks like them. And one of the reasons being is that there's conversations that they don't necessarily know how to have themselves with their loved ones about racism, about oppression, about maintaining their dignity and self-respect, that they would prefer to have with someone that mirrors their likeness. And it's kind of hard to find for them. And, you know, one of the hardest things to do is to encourage or speak to a father that looks like you, or a mother that's struggling with having conversations with her own child, to tell them to have a conversation about racism, or conversations that we believe that should not be held with children at an early age. Like, what do you do? What do you tell your 6-year-old who's asking you about the police officer and what to do when they're pulled over on the side of the street? Or what do you tell your daughter who's afraid to wear her hair to school a certain way because she doesn't know how the school administrators will speak to her? These are conversations that people of color dread this day and age, right? They wake up trying to parent their inner child within themselves because they're afraid, but also try to parent the other child who they brought into this world. You know, when I think about many of the systemic oppression and the things that our families are concerned about, we also have our constituents who are afraid to have kids at this particular time, right? One of the main concerns is, do I really want to bring a child that looks like me into this world? Now, that's a concern, and that's a thought that no one should have to grapple with. But many of our constituents who are majority Black, African American, are grappling with these questions, right? When we think about our constituents who are small business owners, you know, some of the main questions is, why can I receive certain contracts that many of my white peers receive from the city, right? There's like a breakdown in distribution when it comes to resources. So from the individual who has a low income, concerned about their livelihood, concerned about finding employment, maintaining their dignity, but more importantly, their safety, to the small business owner trying to survive and trying to make ends meet, you know, there's this concern about resources, safety, and dignity and respect. And when we think about DEI and what does it look like in our work, we want to make sure that people have a place, especially people that look like us, have a place where they can receive 5-star services from people that look like them, right? Just because you can't afford 5-star doesn't mean that you don't deserve to receive the best. And that's our mantra at Fathers Uplift. And that's what we work to do, despite the systemic oppression that you're currently experiencing as a person of color, right? How can you find dignity within, but also the resources that you may not have had access to otherwise without the network? How can we get you connected to those resources? And that's our approach to tackling the work. And that's how it shows up at Fathers Uplift in our community.
Charles, thank you so much. I love that idea of dignity. It reminds me of, I don't know if you've all ever seen at the middle school age sometimes where girls are a lot taller than boys. You'll see sometimes girls trying to shrink themselves. And I remember when I was working at a Boys and Girls Club, we said, stand up straight, be proud, and be tall. And so many Black people, so many immigrants, so many people of color are constantly shrinking themselves, constantly trying to figure out, how do I fit in? I know Isabel Wilkerson talks about, the roots of so much of this. Like, if only I dress a certain way, if only I wear my hair a certain way, maybe I can, walk safely through society. And I appreciate you bringing that to bear, what that weight is every day growing up, no matter how successful you are, what that looks like for individuals of color. And I'm so grateful for the work that you do to tackle that every day. Let's go to a poll. So everyone who's participating, we want to learn a little bit more about you before we go into our next question. And our first question, I'm going to turn over to Becky to do this, is about your wokeness journey. What is your level of diversity, equity, and inclusion awareness? And so we've got 5 options. Are you very woke? Like, you are so awake, you can't close your eyes, you see it all, everything that's happening up? Or are you just waking up like, oh, I didn't even know what was happening, or somewhere in the middle? So you should see that poll pop up on your screen right now. We'll give you about 30 seconds to answer that question. I don't have the Jeopardy music ready to go, so go ahead, answer that question. We're just curious. It's anonymous, so you can be completely honest. You're in a safe space. We're just curious where people are on this journey to really understanding how issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, systemic racism show up in your work, how it affects the work that you do each and every day. So let's give it 10 more seconds. 10, 9, 8. You can do it. 7, 6. One more chance. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Becky, can we see the results?
All right, there you go. Here we go.
All right, this is a pretty woke crowd. I'll have to say, this past couple years, if this past couple years didn't wake you up, you better go see somebody. So this is really helpful to know where people are, and for us to moderate the conversation. And we hope when we get to QA that people will be very honest and get to some real tools that you need, real questions that you have as we get there. So thanks for being honest. Let's go back to Sandra, and I want to ask you the question. We talked about this racism pandemic and how it's disproportionately impacting communities of color. Can you tell me a little about how this racism pandemic and all of the elements of it have really affected the work that you do in the past year?
It's just my thing that keeps giving me problems. Sorry. So what we've been facing with this racism pandemic is, as I mentioned, the digital divide was very apparent, right? We all knew it was there for years, but I think during this time, it's even more so that our neighborhood, which is considered a colored neighborhood, has faced that. Children were left without digital devices, didn't have the Wi-Fi service they needed to connect to schools. Parents were coming to our doors to see if they could connect to our Wi-Fi. We also lent out some of our tablets to our after-school kiddos so that they can also access their schoolwork. So that was very apparent during this time. The other is, there was forgiveness for if you were behind on your rent, if you were not being able to make payments on time. So while this is not considered tragic at this moment, it will be once all this subsides, because at some point people are going to want their money. And so how do you catch up on a year's worth of rent that you didn't pay? Or bills that were neglected, right? Because you were trying to put food on your table. So those are some of the things that we've seen within the organization, as well as uh, food security. That's one of the biggest problems, is food insecurity. We were seeing people. I mean, it came out in the national news from the San Antonio Food Bank, where lines and lines of cars were waiting for food assistance. So that's one of the things that we've had people coming to our door asking for help because they just want to be able to feed their families. So those are some of the things that we've seen throughout this pandemic.
Yeah, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It gets real core real quick, especially in communities that are already fragile as a result of the challenges that we discussed. Thank you. Charles, let's go to you. How has this racism pandemic really shifted or shaped your work? We got to get you off of mute. There you go.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. You know, it's two things. And I think there's many that I could discuss, but there's two things that come to mind that we as an agency have to deal with on a daily basis, right? We have many of our constituents questioning their worth and trying to maintain value for their Blackness, right? I mean, how can you, when you see people look like you being killed before your eyes on a national news outlet, how can you maintain your worth and know that you're important when you see people on television or around you shouting racial slurs and not necessarily showing any conditional regard for their fellow brother or sister who looks like them? Or you see police officers walk away from someone being killed for no apparent reason, right? How can you maintain a likeness for yourself? And that's the deep struggle for many of our Black brothers and sisters at our agency, right? How can I value myself when the world doesn't value me? Right. And that's a question that we have to continue to wrestle with and grapple with as we're sitting down with our fathers and their children. One of our youth told me one day, he said, Charles, if I had a choice to be white, I would take it. So you have this Black young man telling you that if he had the choice, he would take it. He said one of his white friends asked him that question, and he said he couldn't lie to them. He said, you know, if I was white, I wouldn't have to worry about my life every time I go to school. Right? I wouldn't have to worry about, you know, why my skin tone is so dark. I wouldn't have to worry about an administrator being on my back in school because she's assuming that I'm not doing my work because I don't care, as opposed to me not being able to feed my stomach because I'm hungry, right? So these are real life situations that our young men, also our men and our single mothers are struggling from a daily basis. They're scared, they're afraid, right? And there's this sense of worthlessness that they have to fight every day. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and I found this quite astounding, for many of our fathers that are on child support who are men of color, when the stipends came out from the government, they were not able to get that stipend. I think there's an assumption that if you're not paying child support in low-income communities because you don't want to pay child support. I think that's an illegitimate assumption, right? Many of our Black fathers, our brown fathers are not paying child support because they don't want to pay it. They're not paying it because they can't afford it, right? You know, so you imagine taking away someone's license or taking away someone's ability to be able to provide for their family. How can we expect them to pay into a system when they can't even care for themselves? So what we had to do was partner with a foundation to try to give them $500 stipends because they wasn't able to get that money from the federal government. So there's certain benefits, resources that automatically come down the pipe that they don't have access to. And we as an agency have to struggle to find alternative ways to get them connected to those resources. But those are the two main things that we've seen impacted our population significantly, right? Connection to resources, as well as this constant fight to convince yourself that you're important, especially if you're Black or brown.
And I thank you for articulating how much policy matters. You know, sometimes we have these knee-jerk reactions. I mean, we think about it in the 90s crime legislation. We are going to punish, we are going to provide justice. And sometimes we don't think about the consequences and how policy can really make things even worse at sometimes. And we have to be willing to make some changes. And I really appreciate you articulating that. I want to go back to Sandra. There's a great song lyric that says you've got to sweep around your own backyard before you sweep around mine. And I wonder if we could use that lyric in order to talk about the internal house cleaning that has to happen. So often when we think about DEI, we think about something I need to fund, something someone else needs to do, something I need to talk about or tell somebody. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what is the sweeping up within your own organization that you've had to do, with your organization, with funders and philanthropists on your board. What has this journey looked like inside for you?
So our staff, first of all, is again predominantly Hispanic, Latino. It's not a requirement, right? But that's the community that we're serving. So people who come in, first of all, we need to make sure that they're bilingual, especially those providing direct service, because the majority of the people that we serve are Spanish speakers. So that's a must in order to communicate with them and to understand what their needs are. So within the organization, we have a few people who live within the area. Again, not a requirement, but we have a better understanding of what the needs are. And so for those not within the area, I mean, we talk to them about what the area is like. One of the first things that they do when they're onboarded is that we drive them through the neighborhood, right? Most times we drive them through the neighborhood when we have staff available to let them know this is what this side of town looks like. This is what people are talking about when they say the west side, right? This is what people are talking about when they make those assumptions of what it is to reside on our side of town. So we let them get the feel of the neighborhood. And and in-house, as far as the staff, I think we all have a good understanding of what our community is made up of, how they see life and how they view things. So I wouldn't say we necessarily have to clean up within the organization, because our staff really gets what the neighborhood is like. As far as our board, we have a couple of people that represent the neighborhood who grew up and went through our kindergarten system back in, I don't want to date them, but several decades back. And so so they get an understanding. So we always want to make sure that we have that representation. Now, while we serve a lot of single mothers at times, we also, so where we're lacking is that we don't have that male representation of having a Latino male on our board to also get that perspective, right? So that's what we're wanting to look for this year, is to have that representation on our board, but also to have a diverse board as well. But when it comes to philanthropy and foundations, I think we've been overlooked in the past, and I think for several reasons. First, we're a small organization. We're serving a community that's been underserved for generations. So I think sometimes it's not viewed as important. If you want to have this honest conversation, I don't think they view our side of town as being important, as the people living there. You know, I feel they see like it's generational. So there's nothing we can do to help, but there's a lot we can do to help. We can empower. That's part of our mission, is to encourage, educate, and empower. If we educate our people to know that there's better out there, to know that there's things that they can do, not necessarily to move out of the neighborhood, but what they can do to improve their living situations, right? There are tons of people who would do that. But the thing is, I don't think many philanthropists see that as a need. And it is a need. And I can speak on that personally, because I come from, again, I've lived within this area for a good number of years, and I have a very good support system when it comes to family. I chose to do things the hard way. I became a teen mom. I, had to depend on government assistance for a while, but I knew this was not my life, and I knew this is what I wanted for myself, for my children. And so I found the necessary resources to make a better life, right? And there are so many people like myself that want to do the same thing, but if the resources are not there, if the funding and the help is not there, then it's never going to happen. Right. And I'm sorry if I get emotional, but I just think people need to see people, no matter what color they are, as people, as individuals. not as this is a cycle that cannot be broken, because it is. There is a cycle that can be broken. And so, I'm sorry, but that's just how I feel people should be seen, as a person, not as a color.
Amen. Thank you for sharing that and spotlighting those issues. I also really think you rose an important issue about diversity shows up in different ways when you talked about, do you have men on your board? And, I think, even for us, I used to be young, and sometimes I consider myself a young man of color, but I'm not. And so we need to make sure that we have young men of color on our My Brother's Keeper board. I grew up poor, but I haven't been poor for a while, thank God. And so are we proximate to the communities that we're serving, and making sure that as you put leadership bodies together, that you're really thinking about the true diversity of the people that you're serving. Charles, I want to hand that broom over to you next. Before I do, though, I want to go to one more poll question to get a sense, and Becky, if you want to pop that up, to get a sense from folks that are gathered here today. What are the most pressing issues related to DEI that you're dealing with in your city? And there's some options here. Is it culture? Is it general awareness? Is it staff? Is it leadership, education, public policy? So we just want to kind of get a sense of what you're dealing with. And the Zoom functionality is limited. So we know that you are probably dealing with more than one, but you can only pick one. So if you had to pick the thing that is the most core, the most fundamental challenge that you're dealing with right now, what is it that you would pick? Would just love to know where people are struggling and what you're grappling with. So let's give it 10 more seconds. 10, 9, go ahead and get those answers in. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And all right, Becky, what did we find out? Interesting. So most people are really grappling with the disparities in education. I know we see that in our work, especially with Opportunity Youth, that we're already on the border. What does it mean that our schools have been closed and it's virtual schooling? Will they come back? So we've got education as number one, and then leadership. Yeah, Charles, I'm hoping you'll talk about leadership when I hand you the broom, and then culture. Thank you. Actually, and then public policy, and then culture. Thank y'all for that question and answering that. It's really helpful. Charles, so let me turn that sweeping broom over to you. Would love to know what that internal work you have to do, and really would love for, you've been working with foundations, you've been working with government, you've been working with partners. If you want to take that broom over to their house and say, this is how I wish they would use the broom, let us know what you think.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Internally, we've definitely been looking at our leadership structure, especially of our board of directors as well as the advisory committee of fathers and young men in our community, right? Are we giving them the opportunity to make key decisions in our agency, right? And really think about how we should be addressing and thinking about race. How vocal should we be, right? I think one thing that my mentor told me recently said, Charles, when you're silent, you're not helping. So you got to be more vocal. So how, as an agency, are we being collective and making sure that our voice is heard when it comes to addressing issues pertaining to racism in our community, right? Are we sitting by just being quiet, or are we saying something? Are we saying something to our constituents? Are we saying something to the funders that we have the privilege of partnering with? Are we saying something to our government affiliates? Or are we being quiet? And I think, our goal is to be more vocal. So we've really been thinking about how can we be more vocal and really interweave that into our plan internally. I think externally, I heard this statement recently. Someone said, Charles, either you're racist or you're anti-racist. But I would add another statement to that. Either you're racist, anti-racist, or blind. And I can tell you, many of my interactions with individuals that have the opportunity to invest or to contribute to our organization initially did not see the real me. And the reason why they didn't see the real me, because I was afraid to show it to them, right? When you think about what you're taught as a person of color growing up, one of the main things is you have to be close to perfect, right? There's certain things that you can't do that other populations can do and get away with it, right? You have to conduct yourself a certain way. You have to speak a certain way, right? You have to make sure that everything you do is close to perfection. And to be honest with you, that's exhausting you know, and when you automatically don't know the funder or know the person that can make an investment, you automatically have your shield up as a Black person, right? Because you want them to see the best of you, what you perceive is the best of you, as opposed to unlocking who you really are. And, you know, this past year, I've become more confident and also more honest with who I really am. And, you know, and I've been telling funders, you know, and people that support us, you know, what I really think about this whole situation. But here's the caveat, right? Is that, you know, I would encourage individuals that are looking to be able to clean their own house is to not rush to making drastic assumptions. What does that mean? I'm going to tell you. So if someone of color who you're vetting sends an email with a error in it, right? It doesn't mean that they're incompetent. It probably means that they're doing more than one thing, right? Or maybe they're wearing two hats, right? Maybe that's warrants a conversation. When you're creating application processes for vetting, there's a lot of leaders out there that look like me that may not have the degrees, right? But they have the talent and they have the connection to people, right? How do you get to know them? How do you encourage them to show another sense of themselves while providing technical support? One of the most beneficial things that I've received from one of our first funders where we had no business experience or anything was, hey, they said, hey, Charles, we're going to give you funding, but we're also going to give you technical support. We're going to train you. We're going to teach you how to do this appropriately. And I think communities of color, individuals, leaders who doesn't necessarily have the experience in communities of color could benefit from guidance, mentorship, right? But also just authentic conversations about racism. And last but not least, I would say this too, you know, addressing racism and oppression cannot be addressed if we're not calling racism what it is. I've been in rooms where we're having these conversations about racism and the word racism never comes up. Right? It never comes up. I mean, if we're going to talk about it and lean in, we have to lean into it all the way, you know, because 9 times out of 10, if you are trying to gain relationships with a leader of color, please know that they're walking into that room with tons of trauma, with tons of questioning of who they are. And at the same time, they're trying to make a good impression while showing you that they can be trusted with funds to do the work that they were called to do. And that would be my 2 cents as to what can we do in our own house, but also what can we do across the aisle.
Tell the truth, Dr. Daniels. There's that country saying that says, put the hay out where the goats can get to it. Don't hide it up, put it out. I tell you, that was one of my biggest frustrations doing the work of My Brother's Keeper. People wanted to talk about opportunity youth. They wanted to talk about equity. They wanted to talk about diversity, but they didn't want to talk about racist systems. They didn't want to talk about redlining. They didn't want to talk about Jim Crow. They didn't want to talk about racist housing policies. They didn't want to talk about the racist criminal justice system. And if you are not willing to bring it up and talk about it, you are going to continue to skirt around the edges. So thank you for saying that, Charles. We are going to go to your questions because we don't have tons of time left. And I believe Jesse's been collecting questions. So Jesse, why don't I turn it over to you to share questions that have come. And if you have questions, put them in the chat, and I think Jesse will collect them.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you all. This is an incredibly powerful group of speakers, and I know I'm certainly learning a tremendous amount. One question that Patricia Keenan posed is, how do agencies engage mixed race boards of directors in conversation and learning about issues of racism?
Sandra, Charles, who wants to take that one?
Can we repeat the question again? I'm sorry, Jess.
How do agencies engage mixed race boards of directors in conversation and learning about racism?
Yep. So, I mean, my 2 cents would be, I think having individuals come inside of the agency to talk about these various topics is very important. But I think it's also important to have residents in your local community for them to come in and talk to you as well. I'm pretty sure there's many individuals around you that may be willing to come in and speak to you about how they've been impacted by what's going on in their community. And I think that can be just as informative. I do see a lot of consultants being hired, but there's also neighbors in your surrounding community that could also be equally beneficial. We kind of like to use both, right? We like to hear from those we're serving. We like to hear from our community members, but we also like to hear from individuals that have provided consultation in the past. I think another thing is too, we call ourselves, we like to do community assessments and see how people are feeling out there, right? Through qualitative data, but also polling is very important for us as well. So I think if you do those things, you might be able to get some insight into what's going on, but also some adequate trainings that could be supportive to your board. And I would also say, don't be afraid to actually have some of those conversations about, what people are feeling, and set aside some time for people to really reflect on the last couple of months in the board meeting. I think that's extremely important.
Thanks, Charles. Jesse, why don't we go to the next question? We'll have one person answer so we can get to more.
You know what? We don't have a next question yet in the chat. So I may encourage everybody to ask some questions, drop them right in here. But right now, that was the only question from Patricia that has come through.
Any other questions? Well, I certainly have more that I can ask. Don't be shy. Questions, comments, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll give you a couple seconds, see if any come in. If not, I'm happy to ask a couple other questions that I have. So while we're waiting for other questions, I'll ask you both a closing question, which is, we keep talking about getting back to normal, going back to way things used to be. And we also talk about this new normal. And I wonder if you all could say, what do you hope we'll go back to, and what do you hope will be totally different on the other side of this crazy chapter that we're going through in global history right now? Sandra, you want to start?
So I would say that the thing I would like to go back to are hugs. I'm a hugger. And so I know a lot of our clients that come in, I mean, we get to know them, they become part of the family. And so that's one of the things we do when we see them, is to give them a hug. So that's one of the things I would like to go back to. What I would like to see is our neighborhood is, doesn't have the opportunities that others would normally have. So keeping some of these virtual tours available, some of these virtual meetings, right? Because a lot of our people, there's lack of transportation. So having these virtual meetings, workshops that people normally could not attend, still be available. I think this time has really given us, or this moment has given us time to really think about what's important. What do I have to drive to? What can we do in person? How do we, save that time to do other things that are more important, right? When we're meeting with colleagues, or so just trying to decide what can we continue to do virtually, right? Because I would rather put more time into my organization and what we're doing there versus having meetings that I can have like here face to face,
Yes.
And so, but really more importantly, I think, is just keeping those virtual options for people that normally wouldn't have those opportunities.
I love that. I have a friend who's an educator and has 3 children, and she was just saying how she's been able to participate in more community board meetings. She's not having to go around from place to place. I think about myself and how I used to be on airplanes all the time. And while I'm looking forward to seeing people again, I don't want to go back to that level of pace. Charles, I want you to answer the same question, but it looks like we got a couple other questions that came in the meantime. So why don't we go to the audience questions first, and then we'll come back to you to answer the same question.
Absolutely. So Jennifer Huntington asks, how do we do the important house cleaning work individually?
I'll take a stab at that, Michael.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. I really think that, the last couple of months, last couple of years has really put our mind at this state of unease. And oftentimes that is reflected in the way in which we think about people and think about situations. I mean, being in this world the last couple of months, it can make it hard for you to trust people. It can make it hard for you to really get to know people a little bit more and to think about just the good in the world. I mean, essentially we can lose sight of the good based on what we've experienced, in our news outlets throughout the country. And one thing that I would recommend, and that I try hard to do myself and encourage my kids to do, and those that we serve, is that we cannot become a product of what we've witnessed over the last couple of months. When it's hard to love, we have to love harder, right? When it's hard to assume the person's best intentions, we have to assume harder. We have to go against this grain and this push to want to give in to evil or give in to negativity or have these drastic unwanted thoughts. And I would say give love, right? We have to replace it with love. And it's hard to do the love. One of my mentors said, he said, Charles, if you're riding in the car and, someone may have, almost hit you, right? First thing you may think, hey, they're a jerk. They almost hit me. And we're on this, especially in Boston, right? People in Boston drive like insane. It's probably the same thing in DC, right? You are like, this jerk, he just almost hit me. I mean, we always go to that as the first point, but the alternative piece, maybe that person was on their way to the hospital because someone's dying in their family, right? How can we always make room for alternative thoughts and alternative experiences, even when our emotions get the best of us? And that would be one thing that I would consider for us to do internally to actually work on ourselves and stay with the moment and believe in love, believe that our generation need a world where people can love one another and see the best in one another.
I love that, Charles. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I will say I'd rather drive in New York, DC, Chicago, almost any other city than Boston. And I think part of that is just the design of Boston. So we get back to systems. Thank you, Charles. Jesse, other questions? Jesse, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. How important is it for nonprofit organizations to work DEI-related elements into their mission statements? This is asked by John Harney.
Sandra, you want to take that one?
Okay, so I think is really taking a look at your mission and what it says, not only to within the organization, but outside, right? To those coming to you for help. And then figuring out, okay, does DEI apply to that, right? So ours is to encourage, educate, and empower. And so we want to educate our clients, whether it's children, youth, seniors, families, to know what's out there, and then educate them on what's there, and so that they become their own voice, so they empower themselves. Again, I think it's just really taking a look at your mission and how you can apply DEI to that.
Thanks. I muted myself and couldn't unmute. Thank you. Jesse, maybe time for one more question? Now you're on mute, Jesse.
Unmute. Zoom gets the best of all of us, have to say. One final question, and there are more questions in the chat. I encourage everybody to, look at that and think about some of these. There's not enough time to cover everybody. But Alejandro Trejo, apologies for butchering the pronunciation, asks, what is your advice for organizations who are playing catch up in regards to DEI, especially in terms of ensuring that leadership reflects the people they are serving?
Anyone want to take that? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Charles.
Sure. I think it's never too late to start. That would be my feedback, right? I think, what happened in the past is the past, but what can we do now moving forward? Also, there's a lot of organizations there are adopting DEI practices. Don't be afraid to reach out and give them a phone call, schedule a meeting, a coffee, a conversation via Zoom to see what they're doing that's working. So it's never too late. I think sometimes we think it's too late, but right now is the time to actually start, the best time to start. So I would encourage you to go for it.
And I would just add, this isn't just a righteous thing, right? Like, this is what we should be doing. The data just proves out that organizations and companies that have diverse leadership actually fare better. There is something about this word that Brian Stevenson used about getting proximate. about knowing your clients, knowing the people closest to the pain have to be closest to the power. And if your boards and your senior leadership team do not reflect the richness and diversity of the communities that you're trying to serve, you are going to go extinct, and your work is not going to be as rich as it should be and as impactful as it should be. So you've got to do that hard work, and that means some people are going to have to step aside. We saw some examples of that happening this summer where people said, I'm not going to be on this board anymore because we need to change. That means there are going to have to be some tough conversations, but now is the time to do that because the work deserves it. The challenges are that urgent that we're going to have to dismantle and rebuild in order to have the kind of society where all of our young people can thrive and reach their full potential. I think we are out of time, so Jesse, let me turn it over to you to close things out.
Thank you so much, Michael. And as Michael noted, we're just about out of time, so I'll be really brief. I just wanted to thank our outstanding panelists for their courage in answering some of these really hard questions so honestly. There's a lot of learning for everybody, whatever stage of this journey you're on. And I think, this is a great place for us to start. So I also would love to encourage everybody to support the outstanding organizations that they represent. Fathers Uplift here in Boston, House of Neighborly Service down in San Antonio, and My Brother's Keeper and the Obama Foundation, pretty much everywhere. So I would highly recommend that you check those out, support them. And then I wanted to thank San Antonio SVP. Becky did a tremendous amount of work putting this all together. And it's been an absolute pleasure to get to know what, a different chapter does and thinks and is all about. So there's a lot of thank yous. I'm probably missing people, but this has been a tremendous experience.